My name is Kate Edwards, and I will be presenting on entropy as well as the heat death of the universe. Alright, so I kind of try to explain entropy in terms of thermodynamics. It's a little dense and kind of confusing, but bear with me for a few slides. So the second law of thermodynamics is based off of two statements, which is the Kelvin-Planck statement, saying that work can only be done by transfer of heat only if there's two temperature levels, right? So you can't just put like a heat engine between two really hot objects, like it's not going to do anything. You need a hot object and a cool object to transfer heat through it and therefore create work. Clausius' statement says that it's impossible to transfer heat from a low temperature to a high temperature without work, which we all know based on observation, but it's a very important statement. So these statements lead to what's called the inequality of Clausius. So it's essentially saying that dQt for a cycle is less than or equal to 0. And entropy is defined that ds is greater than or equal to this dQt term. In a reversible cycle, that cyclic integral is equal to 0, which essentially says that if you start in a cycle and go through it, there will be no change in entropy, right? So your ds term is 0. So if you have a process that's just 1 to 2, the entropy change will be S2 minus S2. Other facts about entropy is that, so specific entropy itself is a thermodynamic property, so it doesn't actually depend on whether a process is irreversible or reversible, it only depends on your state. It's also measured from an arbitrary reference state, so there's no like really solid definition of what we assign entropies to. So in an irreversible process, right, you get less work out of an irreversible process than a reversible one. Therefore, QH minus QL for irreversible is less than QH minus QL for reversible, meaning that this cyclic integral is now less than 0. And that ds for your dQt for irreversible process is greater than, okay, so if you have a reversible process that's 1 to 2 and 2 to 1, if you add them up, you're going to get 0. If you replace that 1 to 2 with an irreversible process C and add the reversible process B, the overall process is irreversible, so it's less than 0. So we then have that dQt-A is greater than dQt-C, even though they go from state 1 to state 2. If we then apply what we know about entropy and that it's a state property, we see that the change in entropy for C is actually greater than what we use to define entropy for an irreversible process. So to me, this was like kind of confusing to think about, but if we think like, we now we get less work out of an irreversible process than a reversible one, and it's like, where does that energy go, right? We know energy is conserved, so it has to go somewhere. So it's essentially entropy that gets created and that energy is transferred to. So it's kilojoule per Kelvin, so it's a measure of energy. Energy is lost in irreversible processes, and so entropy is that energy loss. It's essentially like unusable energy, right? It's like, why don't we just call it like work out or heat out or give it some other label besides entropy? But it's like in that system, you can't use it. It's just lost to the surroundings. A lot of people describe entropy as like disorder of the universe, but to me, this is really difficult to understand like in a microscopic scale. Like I just think disorder as like my messy room. But I think a better description is how spread out energy is. So I really hate thermodynamic examples. So it's like really confusing when you're trying to explain this with a thermodynamic system. But if we look at our slide, right, and we say that our potential energy is QH, and our kinetic energy at the end is QL, right? And our height is the temperatures. In an ideal system, right, all of that potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, which we can relate to the QH minus QL equals 0 statement, right? So PE minus KE should equal 0. But we know that in reality, the potential energy is always going to be greater than the actual kinetic energy you get out. So because of that, we get this QH minus QL irreversible is less than 0. But we know energy is conserved, so it's like, where does that lost energy go? Where does the energy go from the potential energy to kinetic energy? We know in this example, it's due to friction, right? It's going to slide down, lose some stuff to friction, and that friction is your generated entropy. I don't know if I have time for this video, but he essentially explains that in any process, you're spreading out the energy. And energy is only, actually that statement's backwards. Energy is only useful when it's collected, right? Like going back to that first statement, you can only get work out of something if you have two separate heat states. But if those things are the same temperature, you can't get work out of them. So since entropy is always increasing, the energy is always just being spread out, right? And this is useful to us as engineers because like if the energy is being spread out, we can no longer use it. Another way to describe entropy is that it can be seen as a probability. So think about like all the particles in this room. It's like trillions of times more likely for all of the oxygen in this room to be relatively easily spread out, like evenly spread out. But if I were to like contain all the oxygen in this jar, that like the probability of that just happening is like so small that would never happen. And so entropy, like if something is more probable to happen, it will have more entropy. Whereas if it's less likely, it is going to have less entropy. And you can decrease the entropy of a system, but you have to put more work into it, right? In order for me to collect all of the oxygen in this room and put it in a jar, it's going to take a lot of work, which in turn just creates more entropy. Entropy is the only physical law, the second law of thermodynamics, that actually tells us which direction time is going, because since processes are irreversible, we can't go back and redo them. So eventually, all of this leads to the heat death of the universe, right? At one point in time, all of the energy will be so completely evenly spread out that we can no longer use it to create work. And so there's physical theories of like, this may or may not happen, but I think it's the easiest thing to understand as an engineer, just like everything being spread out evenly at one point in time, and that would be the end of the universe. And that concludes my